The Death of Luna by Vera Inber. How are we to manage the things we no longer recollect? After all, what we don't remember for us no longer exists. Owing to the imperfection of our memories, the tender outlines of our childhood are little by little worn away. And the things we do remember, why, they too wither and fade. In my case, for instance, year by year it has destroyed a little more my memory of the swan that struck me with his wing. This swan first appeared to me from amidst an incredibly brilliant and coarse-leaved greenery. He was himself white and splendid, just like the cushion my nanny had. The swan opened his wing with a swing that eclipsed the sunlight, and with this wing he winged me. Sometimes at leisure moments I draw this recollection of mine up from the depths of memory and hold it to the light to scrutinize it like a fragment of old fabric. And this is what I see. The swan is no longer so white as once upon a time. And the leaves, where is their furious bubbling, their luster, their life? Where is all that verdure that looked like green blood? And what was the water like? I can't remember. Thus, time after time, plume after plume, the beauteous bird sheds its plumage. The bird practically exists no longer, and quite recently the thought entered my head. Where could a swan have come from in that humble bungalow country, by that water where that summer I was living? In all probability, it was a he-goose, or even a she-goose, that nipped my girlish leg as she guarded her goslings. And having got as far as the goose, I realized that all was lost. That is why I treasure everything I remember. I feel I want to make fast, while it is still not too late, all these dots, blotches, and nebulosities, all these dying memories. I clearly remember all the gardens I have ever seen. It even seems to me that I recognize by its looks every tree that was to any degree significant. This probably arose from the fact that I was born in a town where green was lacking. Salt flats encroached on it from the direction of the estuary, and the grasses on the outskirts of the town were salty. The boulevard above the sea was the greenest place in town. Here chestnuts bloomed in the spring. There is something of both weddings and funerals about this tree, and the combination of almost black foliage and white flame-shaped flowers with their points tossed skywards. At the end of the boulevard, where begins its liquid and semicircular turn, stood Pushkin. In May, an acacia used to bespringle his Arab curls. In the autumn, the leaves of a chestnut tree rested a while on his shoulder before taking off into the autumnal blue. As for Pushkin himself, raised to the level of trees and birds, he would survey the street named after him that debouched into the boulevard. The poet's bust stood on a pedestal. On the steps of the pedestal lay a lyre. All this was hemmed in by blocks and chains. Such was the Pushkin of my childhood, but we were children. And we children, playing at the foot of the statue, failed to grasp the sculptor's intent. We took it all as gospel and believed that Pushkin had lived the whole of his life just like that, armless, legless, and in chains. In our opinion, he was great mainly because of his misfortune. Poor Pushkin, we would say. In Pushkin Street, there was a house that differed from the rest. Over the gateway hung a plaque. Here lived Pushkin. Here lived poor Pushkin, I said to my father as I was going past one day. From here they used to drive him to the boulevard. Why poor? And why drive? My father protested. In all probability, he used to go on foot. I held my tongue. It seemed to me needless and even harmful to argue with grown-ups. But amid my memories, they are such that time has practically no hold over. The significance of the occurrence, perhaps not even realized straight away, does not permit it to be erased from the mind. I remember a summer day when the smell of the sea mingled with the fragrance of the flowering limes. I remember a gunshot, thunderous, far off. Menacingly it shook the air. This was the shot fired at the town by the mutinous ironclad Potemkin. The pigeon blue June sky of my childhood was hazily lit up by a distant and unknown flame. From his constant and long-standing communion with the cosmos, our teacher Foma Narcisovich had acquired a nebulosity of expression in the circular movements of the stars. Gossamery gray sun flares smoked above his brow. Spectacles drooped on his nose, and over them his eyes held a transcendental and absent-minded expression. Our old physics master was noteworthy for the fact that he once quite involuntarily discredited the universe in the eyes of 30 persons. With one careless swipe of the telescope, he upset the world in which it was our lot to live, and another and more dreadful intervention was required to restore the shaken system of creation. The class book would burst open like a storm cloud. From it descended thunderstorms, a hail of nasty remarks, and an oblique rain of figure ones. With all the strength of his fanciful half-Polish diction, our old Foma would come crashing down on a class insufficiently conversant with Boyle's Law. "Who you are?" Foma would ask us, peering over the top of his glasses. "You unfully listeners and unfully learners are. I am hither in order to teach you. But you instead copy out on sly one another's classwork, and then I hold myself by the pocket and cry. Caution, thief! For he who stealeth knowledge from another can also steal a purse with money." Having stormed for the prescribed time, he would without fail call out a Vigdorchik girl. This was the only name he remembered and had incorporated in flesh and blood. All the other names were an abstraction in the class book, with the addition of a very concrete mark in the lower range. But there were 6 of the Vigdorchik sisters, and they were dispersed throughout the classes. To a girl they made little progress, were poor scared things, crybabies, and red of cheek. It was impossible not to remember them. In our class they were represented by a whole pair. "Vigtorchik, Rosalia," Foma would exclaim. "Please come to the board." And Rosalia Vigdorchik, large, tearful, covered with down like a crimson fruit, would step forth for the next of her tortures. As though all the more graphically to set the lofty element of natural science apart and remove it from the plane of other and less worthy disciplines, the physics lab was situated in a special outbuilding on the roof of the annex, up to which led a spiral staircase. In front of the lab there was a small open space with a low parapet, a sort of balcony, whence the whole town and the port could be seen. From there you could even see the lighthouse, like a slender candle extinguished at dawn. And often in the hours of spring, this far-off lighthouse, the gentle curve of the pier, the lilac wilderness of the sea marked by an odd sail. All this was filled with such a penetrating sense of bird space that we quite stopped listening to what was being explained. "Who you are?" our teacher would ask on such occasions. "You unattenders and fantasiasts are. Vigdorchik Rebecca, please come to the board." He was quite a good teacher, was our old Foma, but he was blinded by his mistrust of unfully learners and unfully listeners. He reckoned that the world was full of Vigdorchik sisters incapable of understanding the nature of things. But at times, especially during the cosmography lessons, he would experience moments of happiness when he forgot all about us and we would listen to him spellbound. He grew calm and luminous. His irregular sentences became almost beautiful. With confident gestures, he manipulated a solar system made of wood, wire, and cardboard. The tiny sphere of the moon slid along a wire round a little terrestrial globe. The earth was curved, a ship the size of an almond shell, sailing away along an arc, would be lost to sight, beginning with the outlines of the hull. It voyaged away over convex seas, and we sailed with it. The acid-scorched table in the physics lab was cleared of all unnecessary objects. Alexander, the lab attendant, a polite, quiet man in love with science, used a rag to wipe the bell glass from which the air was to be pumped. We were doing air pumps. A sparrow was put on this same table by Alexander, one of the sparrows that twittered on our physics watchtower and made up their dietary deficiencies with our breakfast crumbs. Foma explained to us that as the air was pumped out, the bird, being deprived of food for breathing, would begin to pant for breath. In this way, we should be convinced by our own eyes of the existence of airless space. For, added Foma, raising a finger, nature abhors those deficient in faith. Alexander, the attendant, started turning the handle of the wheel, and the sparrow, placed under the bell glass and progressively deprived of food for breathing, did begin to pant for breath. It tried to fly up to the transparent cupola beyond which, so near and so unattainably, lay freedom. It dashed its wings against the glass wall, adhered to it like a butterfly squashed flat by a hurricane. Thus it remained for a moment motionless, and we, standing around the table, perceived the stormy shuddering of the down on its breast, just at the place where the heart was. Tearing itself away from the glass, the sparrow fell heavily to the bottom of the bell. It lay on its side, jerking its right wing and moving its beak about in front of itself, as though in search of water. It turned its head away from us. Maybe it was suffering, apart from suffocation, from the ring of motionless and brilliant fires that were our eyes. Alexander, in love with science, pumped more and more slowly. Looking interrogatively at Foma, he awaited a wave of the hand, a movement of the lips, before letting go of the pump and releasing the bird. This is indeed how it is usually done. After all, we were now convinced that airless space existed. But our teacher did not stir. He was obviously possessed by the demon of logic who demands the continuation at any cost of what has once been begun. Suddenly a suppressed sigh was heard in our midst, as though it were not only the sparrow that was short of air. Then came the sound of weeping. We broke ranks, and then Rosalia Vigdorchik was revealed, bathed in tears. Covering her face with an exercise book, she was sobbing as she did after giving the worst of her answers. "Vigdorchik, Rosalia," said our physics master in a loud voice. "What signifies this weeping?" "The sparrow," replied Rosalia. "I'm sorry for that little sparrow." Giving Vigdorchik a 1 for noise-making in class, the teacher said, "That the feathered creature should perish was inevitable. As I already expressed above, science abhors tender soulishness. Either you will put your hand without trembling into the fire of the acquisition of knowledge, or else you sit at home and handwork, let us say, preserves and picklings. The scales of science shall not once swell-cillate." Not looking at us and not waiting for the bell, Foma left the classroom, and we remained alone in a cold world and airless space where the scales of science abode in eternal and majestic equilibrium, and where the tremulous tissue of the heart was merely an object of experiment. Our supposition appeared improbable, but it was confirmed. Foma was in love. We discovered this through the way his eyes shone when he spoke of her, of his beloved, through the tone of voice, a tone that does not lie even when the words do. His beloved was beautiful. She visited him of an evening when the air was beginning to grow dark blue. At times she showed mistily from beneath a veil, but when she was tranquil, nothing could be more delightful than the way she glided amid the fragile glass of the instruments with their rainbow color play. For the female loved by Foma was Luna, the moon. To her he devoted a large number of teaching hours, thus curtailing all the other regions of the sky, even including meteorites, which he dismissed with a swish of the hand. Devoting special attention to Luna, we learnt many interesting things about her. We learnt that, like the sparrow in the bell glass, she was deprived of air, that food for breathing. But we also learnt that this was immaterial. There wasn't anyone there to breathe. For Luna, is dead. There were described to us with unbelievable power the gloomy magnificence of the arch of heaven, black from the absence of atmosphere, the hallucinatory distinctness of the constellations, the great mass of the sun suspended in icy night, and finally the flaming of the blood-red and shaggy globe that filled half the sky, the flaming of our earth. And on Luna herself there was no air, no water, no sound, no wind, no coolth, no damp, only the succession of light and shade. Sharp frost and torrid heat. The toothy chalk mounds and black hollows of the planetary skeleton. So this then was what Luna was like, the Luna we loved, who combined in herself the brittleness of a newborn goatling and the roundness of a child's cheek. Once at lessons, Foma informed us that on the following evening, if the sky was clear, we must assemble at our secondary school, whence we should for the first time be properly shown the moon. The telescope was brought and erected while we were at home. It was a small, not too powerful, aged university telescope. Arriving that evening, we straightaway sensed the unaccustomed presence of the instrument, to which it was granted to commune with the stars. It stood on our open space, three-legged, emaciated, queer. There was something attractive and old-time about it. It couldn't be budged. Everything that evening was unusual. The air was unusual, too warm for autumn. The school building, transfigured by silence and emptiness, the desks smelt of dust and abandonment, and the flooring groaned beneath our feet. In the daytime, we'd never heard the parquet groaning. And above all this, above the dark school building, above the falling leaves, above the breathing of earth and sea, above our black aprons and tightly plaited pigtails, above this youthfulness of ours, hung a moon in its first quarter. It was large, slender, cool. On one side it flowed around the insubstantial sphere of Luna herself, shadowed by night. First to approach the telescope was Foma himself. He bent down to the tube. We viewed his bowed back. He twisted some sort of little screw at the side. Now everything was in order, and we started to approach one by one. At first our eyes, unskillfully pressed to the eyepiece, made out nothing but the grain of the glass itself, scratches and lines, real or imaginary. But then we perceived Luna, and Luna overwhelmed us. She consisted of silence and chiaroscuro. The silence of Luna was such that we could hear it as we stood on Earth. The chalk craters, warmed by no one's breath, were swamped in a waste and melancholy light. Each crater cast an unbelievably oblique shadow. The surface of Luna was penciled in white and black in a way that does not occur on a living planet. Here, eternity had passed on its way, suppressing the strife of colors. A hollow sound like a sigh swept momentarily over the open space. And Foma, shunting his spectacles on his nose, questioned us. What turmoil is this? We did not answer him. We could not. We did not know ourselves what the matter was. But the thing was that we had been deeply and painfully wounded by the moon. Our teacher let fall an incautious sentence to the effect that one day in the future, after countless millennia, our Earth would be just as dead as the moon. The rest we felt for ourselves. So on it too, on our Earth, black shadows would stretch out like the columns of fallen cultures. And all of us, those still living and those already dead, all of us, beginning with Attila, the scourge of mankind, about whom we had been learning quite recently, and ending with Rose Vigdorchik, all of us, both scourges and roses, would settle smoothly in a light and porous ash on a dead planet. For the first time we thought about death, and this wounded us. Isn't it all the same then how one lives? We asked ourselves. And why then life's hardships? Why try to do this or that? Why should one have to torture oneself by getting up early in winter, when it is so warm in bed and the firewood crackles in the stove? And why go to bed so early in spring when the sea is smooth and a boat is waiting at the bathing place? Thus we pondered, and gradually these thoughts began to be converted into actions. Our class, which had till then been like all other classes, having received its quota of cutting remarks and low marks, but in the permitted quantities, changed suddenly and sharply. We began to play about, despairingly and with malice afterthought. We developed a taste for a sort of part song of Muse, and the whole school re-echoed with the squeaking, squealing, and mewing of a regiment of cats. We would refuse to answer questions on our lessons, impudently asserting that we had forgotten to take the book home, that we had lost the exercise book, that we had a headache, and that we hadn't been set anything. Caught out in our lies, we returned quietly to our seats and, chewing toffee, started to play knots and crosses. A characteristic of this period of our lives was our unkind and jeering attitude towards our teachers. Foma, we particularly came to dislike. We couldn't forgive him for what? We ourselves didn't know. But clearly the moon had something to do with it. Luna, who had robbed us of faith in earth. And the sparrow, too, that had perished so painfully. And what for? Yes, the sparrow in particular. And indeed, in the name of what had the bird been asphyxiated? What was the sense of that airless and soulless experiment? Of this celebrated fire of learning, which was in any case doomed to go out in a dead cold? We plunged deeper and deeper into these thoughts. Worst of all was the fact that we ourselves didn't understand why we felt upset. Our parents were asked to call at the school in order to clear things up. Our scared mothers and fathers conferred sotto voce in the reception room. They too had noticed the change in their children, but the cause was just as incomprehensible to them as to everyone else, as to us ourselves. Shura Karatonov, a fair girl with blue eyes, an orphan who lived at her godmother's, was summoned to the headmistress. There too sat the godmother in a long cloak, holding a handbag and compressing her government official lips. On the headmistress's bosom hung both her medals, the gold one and the silver, signs of the high solemnity of the occasion. The headmistress began to speak in the presence of Shura's godmother, that, quote, worthy woman who had brought up a poor orphan, end of quote. The headmistress asked the girl how it had come about that she, Karatonov Alexandra, a mild and pious secondary school pupil, had behaved so badly and turned into an errant lazybones and mischief maker. Shura Karatonov, jerking a fair pigtail from her chest onto her shoulder, replied that she didn't know, but that latterly she had, quote, all the time felt sick, sort of, end of quote. The headmistress and the godmother exchanged glances. The school doctor ordered Shura to put out her tongue and pressed it down with a spoon. He questioned Shura about her appetite and sleep. Her appetite was good. In the godmother's opinion, too good even. Her tongue was pink. The pit of her stomach didn't hurt. So the mystery remained a mystery. And meanwhile, autumn went its way, but its way was troubled. Autumn, too, came out in cracks, kept splitting with unexpected happenings. Political demonstrations flared up. The authorities quenched them with shots and sabers. A working woman died from severe wounds. She was buried on a day when the rain let through no glimmer of light. The police demanded order, and it was promised them A murky crowd followed the coffin in silence, but this silence was more eloquent than words. All this was passing us by without stirring our thoughts, without quickening our heartbeats. The atmosphere was approaching white heat, but we, in our cool lunar shell, simply couldn't force our way through to life. In our flat, my room was the best of all. Its floor that lay just above the porte cochere was set specially high so as to avoid drafts. Thanks to this, 4 little steps led up from the corridor into the room, and the window reached to the floor. The street we lived on was cheerless and official. In it were situated the schools run by the town, the poorhouse, the foundling asylum, 2 churches, and the artillery depot. By day, all this had a depressing effect, but in the evening, when I had put out my light, it was marvelous to sit on my window, as though on the watershed between 2 watercourses, the street and the room. The street, unpleasant by day, grew beautiful at this hour, without pedestrians and without shops. Sparsely flecked with lights, it flowed in a fresh stream towards the outskirts. Most often I was visited by Zoya Ratazzi and Olya Schumacher. Sitting, the 3 of us, on the low, wide windowsill, we would talk of the future. What do you think things will be like with you in 10 years' time? We would ask one another. In 10 years' time, the blue-eyed Ratazzi girl would dreamily reply, I shall be in Italy. That is my people's homeland, and I don't know it. I shall live in Rome, the eternal city. All around there will be antiques, and I'll be very happy. In 10 years, gulped curly-haired Olya Schumacher, I expect I shall get married. I shall get married to a certain... I'm not going to tell you, and I too shall be very happy. In 10 years, I would say, I shall be very happy. Gradually, these conversations ceased. What meaning had they for us now, 10 years and even the eternal city with its laughable epithet, compared with the real eternity that had plunged down upon us from the moon? And yet there came an evening when once again we 3 gathered in my room as before. It was not yet 8, but it was dark. From the outskirts, from the salt flats of the estuary, autumn moved in on us. On the way, a wind from the sea flew at autumn. Crumpled it, pawned it, shook it, tossed it to and fro above the town. Nothing but a falling of crow's feathers and a flying of oblique raindrops. It's unpleasant in the South in November. We lit the lamp, drew the curtains, and for us the current of the street was cut short. There remained the room, warmed by our breathing, hidden from everything outside, from lunar influences and the winds of earth, locked in the bright circle of the lamp. We found anew, as it were, our lost tranquility. We began to smile, and former thoughts began to come into our heads. What do you think things will be like with us in 10 years' time? Asked Olya, screwing up her eyes pleasurably against the lamplight. In 10 years' time, said blue-eyed Zoya dreamily, I shall be in Italy. I shall be... She stopped. They seem to be shouting in the street. Just a moment ago, someone shouted. We were silent. Yes, in truth, just under the window there in the darkness of autumn, a human cry had started and, strangely somehow, ended. It had started as a long thunder roll, as though calling for help, announcing danger, and suddenly, on a brief hoarse note, it had broken off. We dragged back the curtain, opened the little ventilation pane. Someone in no sort of a hurry was decorously departing down the street. Into the mild and measured tapping of the footsteps there was woven a sort of extraneous little thread of sound, and this too was extraordinarily tranquilizing. In all probability, this was the walking stick on which the passerby, no longer young and even to some extent gout-afflicted, was leaning. All this lasted a minute, no more, as far as the next side street, we calculated. Then suddenly there was a crazy sideways leap, a rushing inwards into the twisting refuge of the side street. Clap! Clattered the walking stick, necessary no longer, flung aside by the runner, and tap, tap, tap pattered the footsteps, moving away. Then all was silent. All was still, but beneath our window some sort of movement could be sensed. A match flared and went out in the wind. From somewhere or other there appeared another light, like that of a lantern. In its ray the rain flew obliquely. 2 or 3 voices sounded. Someone set off at a run, obviously in pursuit of the first runner. In the distance a police whistle wailed. The night grew live with alarm. In the hall my father was putting on his overcoat. We dashed after him. He hurried down the stairs, and so did we. In the street the dampness wafted in upon us. Not far from our porte cochere, people were standing in a semicircle, about 5 of them. When our eyes overcame the darkness, we perceived concentrated backs, heads bent down towards the ground. Someone opened an umbrella, and the lantern standing below shone on the several backs of the umbrella. The lantern stood on the ground. It had clearly been brought by our doorman. There, too, on the ground, sprawled on his back and with his arms wide apart as though for swimming, lay a man in a waterproof. His hat had fallen off. His head was thrown far back. The nape of his neck merged with his shoulders. In his throat, right up to the hilt, a finished knife was planted. He was making strange noises, this man who lay on the ground. First there was a long, drawn-out creaking. Then all at once a bubble would burst. That was the noise he made breathing. "Girls," said my father quietly, "get along home straight away." But disobeying him, we moved closer. The man had a black beard, just like a dead man's, and a skin that was already waxen. But yet he was still not yet dead, you know, and it was not long since the bleeding had commenced. Still, much blood had flowed from the throat, the mouth, and the wound. It flowed very thin and bright, very colorful in the lantern light, and we kept moving farther and farther away, so as not to step in it. Suddenly the man gathered his body together, just as though he wanted to alter his position and lie down more comfortably. But he lay again as he had lain before. He inhaled air, gave a very dull rustle, just as in thick grass. But this time the bubble failed to burst. No exhalation followed. The man died halfway through a sigh, as one falls asleep halfway through a word. Next day it began to be said in the town that the man who had been killed was an agent provocateur. This nocturnal killing had an immediate and terrible effect upon us. Shutting our eyes, we lived through the same thing over and over again, night, a cry, the light of a lantern, and in this light, blood that crawled like an ink stain over an exercise book. And how simply it had been soaked up by the damp autumnal earth between the slabs of the pavement, and how quickly the man had died. Next day, before lessons began, we told the class everything we had seen, and crowding together on a few desks, the class heard what we had to say. All 3 of us told the story, interrupting one another. We were sitting talking, the 3 of us, just like now. The lamp was alight. You've forgotten to say that we had closed the window. That's just what I'm saying, that the lamp was alight. We were talking about what things would be like with us in 10 years' time. And suddenly we heard, "Go on, tell them what we opened the window." We opened the window. He was lying on the ground. A lantern was burning. He was wearing a coat, you know, a waterproof one. The blood was flowing straight onto the ground. No, it wasn't like that. First of all, he shouted, but that was earlier. The knife was here, look, where the collar stud is, underneath the throat. He breathed in and then didn't breathe out. And on hearing this, the whole class, 30 in all, deeply and greedily breathed out air from the very bottom of their chests. It is a remarkable thing. That day saw the end of our lunar fears. We had once more been cast down to earth, and terrestrial proportions and distances again acquired power over us. Eternity was once more far away and harmless. Luna hung as before in her far offness, while here on earth, a lantern burnt, lighting up earthly affairs. The man who had killed was trying to escape through the tangle of side streets, letting his people know of the traitor's death. The Cossack knout and the prison cell awaited him. But he wasn't thinking about that. On Earth, events made things hot and crowded. There were so many of them on Earth that not a moment was left for Luna. We had breathed out air and breathed it in again. It was the air of an agitated epoch, when it was necessary to breathe with a full breast or not to breathe at all. What did eternity matter to us? And what was eternity itself compared with the political demonstration that flared up? That's the word, flared up on a sunny autumn day on the Marine Boulevard by Pushkin's statue. How colorfully it fluttered in the air, the crimson flag that had suddenly sprung up on the pedestal of a statue, which had been transformed into a tribune. How quickly Pushkin was surrounded by the Sunday crowd, in which there were also several schoolgirls. A man with a large forehead, an angular man, tense and concentrated, rose up on a step of the statue, there where the lyre lay, tore open his jacket collar at the throat, and grasped the air with all 5 fingers. "Comrades," he began loudly in the watchful silence, "the time has come when..." 1905 was drawing near.